But before I start, I actually just want to make a case for why you should care about the Sirah. Why do you have to? We just learned what is Sirah. Why should you care about the Sirah? Why should you learn about the Sirah? And there are at least four reasons that it is absolutely essential for every single Muslim to learn a detailed account of the life and example of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The first reason is because you cannot understand the Quran without understanding the Sirah. Okay, the Quran was revealed into a human experience. There are contexts for how and when and why the surahs were revealed. And if we don't understand the context, we're not going to understand the Book of Allah. So if you want to understand the Quran, you have to know the Sirah. That's number one. Number two is to love Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. This is a condition of faith. We have, this is not something, it's not a nice to have. This is a condition of faith to love Rasulullah. You cannot love someone you don't know. And you are missing out not knowing the greatest creation, the best creation that has ever existed, Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. So loving Rasulullah requires knowing him, and that's the second reason we have to learn the Sirah. The third reason is for the invaluable lessons that we can extract from learning the Sirah that we can reapply to our lives today and to difficult situations we are all facing in our families, in our personal lives, and even collectively as a community and as an ummah. There are so many lessons to extract, and that's what really the beauty of Celebrate Mercy is. It brings the Sirah to life. And then the fourth reason is it gives us all a shared history. So to create a shared sense of belonging and a shared sense of identity, a people needs a shared history. That's why in every single country in the world, kids learn their country's history. Why do you learn the history? It's not so we don't repeat it. That's actually not why. Usually we glorify the history of a country and we think we should repeat it. That's obviously make America great again. What is that about? That's about repeating history. So it's not so we don't repeat it. It's actually so we have a shared identity. And we are the most diverse community in America as a community, if you are an American Muslim, but we're the most diverse, faith community, period, globally. What do we have in common? If we don't have shared national histories, but we do have a shared history in the Sirah. These are our spiritual ancestors. And when we can refer back to this common reference, we can create a common identity and a cohesive, united, spiritual whole. Without that, we don't have enough binding us together. So when you want to take away someone's identity, when you want them to forget who they are, you take away their history. So not learning the Sirah is the taking away of our own history. So those are four reasons that we need to learn the Sirah. So I hope that that motivates you to stay tuned and understand who Rasulullah was. The second thing I want to set sort of out before I jump into the birth of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, is the broader context of the region, because we're going to start to talk about traveling to different parts of the region and what was going on. But I want you to understand where Arabia, where Mecca was in reference to the rest of the world. This is real history. This happened in real life within an actual historical timeline where there were other things happening around Mecca and Medina and Arabia. Mecca and Medina and the Arabian Peninsula was quite, bluntly, the backwaters of the world. Nobody cared or paid attention to it. The two superpowers were Persia and Rome, the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. And they ruled the entire Middle East and parts of Europe. So they were in constant war with each other over like 1,000 years, competing to who would one up the other. They were competing over, they were always fighting over Jerusalem, fighting over Egypt, fighting over different parts of what we call now the Middle East. They never really cared to even fight over the Arabian Peninsula. It was not seen as valuable. The people there were not seen as having built anything of significance, anything of value. They were not seen as civilized by these sophisticated superpowers. They were the last, they were not even on their radar to fight over. Okay, they were just a bunch of warring Arabian tribes who had not really shown anything, built anything. They weren't a place like Jerusalem. It wasn't like a place like Egypt that had this, or Persia, with this like grand civilization. Why is that important? Why am I emphasizing this? Because this backwater of the world rose up within one generation to not only conquer Rome or Persia and win wars against the Byzantine, but to rule the entire region that these superpowers used to rule essentially the known world. How, and the only factor, I mean, this is so important, was the birth of this man, Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. That was the only thing that changed. To take this group of people from absolutely contributing, on the world stage, very, very little, to ruling the same people and the same regions that these superpowers weren't, didn't even see them as valuable enough to go conquer or to even think about. So the significance of Rasulullah والسلام, and the message he brought historically, just from even a completely secular point of view, cannot be overstated. This is a miracle by any standard of measurement. His birth, his existence, his message, his impact, his influence, his legacy is miraculous by any measure. So with that as sort of the intro, let's go ahead and start to discuss his actual birth. So he was born on the 12th day of Rabi' al-Awwal during the year of the elephant. And it's called the year of the elephant because it's the year that famously a king from Ethiopia, Habasha, marched to Mecca with an army of elephants to destroy the Kaaba because it was competition for a temple that he was building. And we know the story, that was when Allah sent birds that pelted his army and destroyed it. It was a miraculous event that was observed by everyone in Mecca. And that year of the elephant was the year that Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam was born. It is the equivalent of the year 570 in the Western calendar. Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam was born not only during a year where there were miracles, but the day of his birth, several miraculous things happened. And we just heard from Sheikh Abdul Nasser Janga that there was a miraculous sense, with his mother, that she was carrying something miraculous, that there was light. There was light even in the face of his father. But these were other miracles that coincided with his birth. The collapse of 14 towers of Kisra's palace, right? Foreshadowing the fall of Kisra in Persia. The magician's fire extinguished, which had been blazing for over 1,000 years. Again, the foreshadowing of extinguishing the fire of shirk. And Lake Sawa, which is a lake in modern day Iraq, dried up. These are all signs, for those who reflect, of the miraculous nature of his birth. He was born in the house of Abdul Muttalib, his grandfather. who also performed the aqiqah on the seventh day and invited all of Quraysh. And of course, as you may know, aqiqah is when, in celebration of a child's birth, there is a sacrifice done, and the meat of the animal is shared with the community. Um, Amina, the Prophet's mother, and Abdul Muttalib were inspired, both of them, with dreams to name him Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam. And this several narrations explain that this name was almost unknown before his birth. There are some narrations that say that some people were named this before, but generally the idea was this was a brand new name. It was a name that no one had ever heard of, and it meant um, praised in the heavens and the earth. Muhammad, praised, the one who is praised in both the heavens and the earth. And the famous hadith that encourages us to name our children after the Nabi, Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, Muhammad. And now, as you all know, it is the single most popular name in the world, naming our children and our boys after Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, as was promised in the Quran. وَرَفَعْنَا لَكَ ذِكْرَكَ, where one of the criticisms or the detractions that were leveled against Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, that because he had no boys, his name would be forgotten, right? Because your boys carry your name. Well, of course, his name is the most remembered name in all of history, and his life is the most documented, as we heard, the most documented life story in all of history by far. Um, so the custom of the Arabs was to send children into the desert away from the city to be nursed for at least a full 2 years. And there were different reasons for that. One is they wanted them to learn pure Arabic, and Mecca was a metro, an urban metropolis. There were people from all over that would come for as merchants and for commerce. And so the Arabic was not this pure Arabic, this pure Arabian dialect. And so they wanted children to learn this proper Arabic outside of the city. It was also that outside of the city, the air was cleaner. They thought that it would be there would be less, contamination, less uh, less disease even from different people coming in and out of the city. Now, Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam's father passed away before he was born. And so he was born into this world where he was already an orphan. He was born an orphan. And as such, despite his very noble lineage, because he was an orphan, he was seen as disadvantaged, as someone who wouldn't, as a child who didn't have, a father to kind of take care of or pay properly the wet nurse and so forth. And so it was hard for Amina radiallahu anha to find somebody to take her son. And so finally she found Halima Sa'diya, who herself was also rejected by other families as a wet nurse because she looked so sickly, so malnourished. Her own child was so malnourished. Her even the animal that she was riding on looked like it had no milk. They were very poor, and so these two families met, both of them being um, shunned or rejected by everyone else, and found each other. And then, of course, the barakah of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam immediately changed the reality of Halima's situation. She suddenly had, massive amounts of milk that she could nurse her own child and Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, that her animal suddenly was overflowing with milk. And so they could drink and they had prosperity and they had all these blessings immediately after um, being in contact with Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, because he brought so much immense barakah to them. Um, During this time when he was in the desert, angels came, and this is the splitting of his chest, and this is, in Sahih narrations, where his chest was split, and the black spot that we all have in our hearts, that nafsani black spot in our hearts, this part, this spot was extracted, was excised, was taken out of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam's heart, and his heart was washed with Zamzam, and his chest was brought back together. So this miraculous like heart surgery occurred when he was very young. He was then returned to his mother when he was 4 years old. So think about this. It's almost hard for us to imagine that a wet nurse would take your child for his toddler years, and his mother finally got him back, and only had 2 more years with him. He was a child that had faced so much tragedy, and so his heart was so softened uh, by the tragedy that he felt. And at the same time, he was showered with love by those who did take care of him. But his mother took care of him until he was 6, and then she also passed away when she was traveling back from Yathrib. And then Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, after that, was taken in by his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, who, as we heard, loved him, absolutely adored him. And he preferred him over his own children, alayhi salatu wasalam. And he would seat him in like a special mat in the Kaaba. He gave him all these special gestures because of his goodness, his beauty that just radiated out of him, that anyone could see and anyone could perceive. But then again, tragedy hit Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, where after 2 years, when the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam was only 8 years old, his grandfather passed away. And if you think about it, by 8 years old, who has he already lost? He's lost his father before he was even born. Then he lost his mother when he was 6. And now he's lost his grandfather, who was his father figure. And he's only 8 years old. And so take comfort in that the best of creation was tried so much, was put through so much hardship and tragedy. This is a man who buried every single one of his children except one. So if you are going through a hardship in your life, understand that you are following, you are in good company. It's not a reflection of Allah's anger with you. It's not because don't let anyone tell you, or don't let yourself think that it's Allah is abandoning you, because the best of creation, the most beloved of Allah, had these tragedy after tragedy in his life. So under Abdul Muttalib's care, um, there was a severe drought, and Abu Talib prayed for rain, asking Allah um, for rain by the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and it did rain, and rain came down at that time. Now, as a child, and this is very interesting, it's been pointed out by several Sirah teachers that so many of the prophets had the job of being a herder. The prophet was no exception. He also, alayhi salatu wasalam, grazed goats in his childhood. And this taught, prophets, and teaches many skills. And this is a beautiful hadith. Each of you is a shepherd, and each shall be accountable for his flock. So he had this experience of having to take care of, having to be a shepherd, having to herd animals, having to care for them, having to be by himself in the wilderness, a time of great reflection. And these were all things that were readying him for his purpose, for his mission. And I want to mention something really important. Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam did not get revelation until he was 40 years old. And up until that moment, he was being readied by Allah. He was being trained and crafted, and his heart was being ready, was being formed to receive wahy. And all of these things went into that, including not despite of, but because of, and including these losses that he faced in his life were part of the plan to ready his heart to be a mercy to all the worlds. These were not deviations from the plan. This was the plan. And so when your life takes these tragic turns, don't see them as my life has gone off track. No, this is the track. This is forming you and readying you and purifying you and preparing you for your purpose, just as it was the case for the best of creation, Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. So this I want to spend a little bit of time on this because it's a very important incident that occurred during the childhood of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. When the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam was 12, Abu Talib needed to go on a business trip. And, these were usually trips that did not include children. You don't take your kids, you don't take children on these very dangerous trips. Remember, his father died on a business trip, his mother died during travel, and even his grandfather. So these were very these were very arduous, unsafe kind of trips that you don't take children on. But Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam was so attached to his uncle. He was the the last he had already lost so many people, and he was so attached to him. He loved him so much, and he absolutely cried and cried and begged to come. And his uncle saw how much he felt it too. He didn't want to be separated from him, so he took him with him on this trip to Asham, or modern day Syria and Lebanon. And before they got there, they stopped in a place called Busra. And there in Busra, where it was a very familiar stop during these business trips that they would take to Hashem to buy goods and sell them in Mecca, which is how they made their living. They were merchants. So this was a place that they stopped in, frequently on this trip. And there was a monastery there. But it wasn't a place where people went to worship. It was actually almost like a research center. It was like an academic center. And there was a monk that worked there. He was sort of the resident scholar of this monastery. And he was a very, very, um, academic, scholarly man. His entire life was to pore over ancient manuscripts. And he would, before him, there was someone there doing that, and he was trained, and he was going to train someone. So this was someone who was steeped in this knowledge of ancient religious manuscripts. And he was very reclusive. He didn't talk to anybody. He didn't mix with anybody. He just focused on this work of study and research in these ancient manuscripts, as a scholar of his faith, which is most likely a form of Christianity. And what happened is this monk, Hera, saw the delegation, the caravan coming, of these pagan Arabs that he wanted basically nothing to do with. And they did they created, they did their encampment, they set up their tents, and they were resting. And he noticed something very interesting, that there was a child with them, And this child, when he walked, there was a cloud over him. There was always shade wherever he was. He would just walk and there was a cloud shading him. And he thought that was very strange. And then this child sat under a tree, and because the place where it was very shady was crowded, he sat on the sunny side of the tree. And then in front of his own eyes, the monk saw the tree literally bend to shade this child. And he was just like blown away. And he was poring over the ancient manuscripts. And he thought, this is the expected, the prophesied messenger. These are some of his descriptions, and this is him as a child. And so he did something completely unprecedented because he never talked to these pagans. He never even wanted to go outside. He didn't even mix with the townspeople who were there, who were other Christians, but especially these people, and from his point of view, backward pagan Arabs. He didn't want to deal with them at all. But he did something unprecedented because he went out. Not only did he talk to them, but he invited them all to come into the monastery for a feast. And he asked his murids, his disciples, to create this huge feast for all of these people. And it was all because he wanted to talk to and get closer to Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam and understand who this person was. So what happened is they were so happy and excited when you're traveling and you're going to get a nice home cooked meal instead of whatever you're going to, able to make in your encampment. This was a great thing. So they asked this 12-year-old child that was already burdening them and coming with them on this trip, to everybody's annoyance, to just stay with the animals and the goods, and you don't have to have this dinner with us. The grown-ups are going to go eat a nice dinner, and you just stay here and watch over the animals and the goods, and we'll be back, when we're done. Rasulullah sallallahu, of course, had no objection. He sat and he was waiting. And then when they all went, the monk's like, wait a minute, there was a child with you. Where is he? And they were sort of confused, like, what are you talking about? What do you care about this child? And as he became more and more irate, one of them said, "Oh, no, don't worry. They might miss dinner here, so I'm gonna go find him." So he runs back to the encampment, brings Rasulullah alayhi salatu back into the monastery, and the monk just sits with him and starts to talk to him. Asks him questions about his dreams, asks him questions about his habits, and even sees the mark of prophethood on his back. And he's more and more sure, he's more and more like certain that this is the promised messenger. And so he starts to talk to Abu Talib, and he asks him, who is this child? And Abu Talib says, he's my son, as like a loving gesture. And so the monk kind of is taken aback, and he's like, that's not true. He can't be your son. And so this was kind of surprising. And he said, oh, you're right. He's not my son. Literally, he's my brother's son. He said, okay, now you're telling me the truth. And where is his father? He said, his father died. When did he die? He died before he was born. He said, now you're telling me the truth. And so he was just like confirming all of these things. And so he was completely certain this is the prophesied messenger of God. And he told his uncle, if you take him into the Sham, if you take him into Syria, Lebanon, if you take him into the Levant, other people will also notice these signs in him. I'm not going to be the only one who notices. And they may not have the same good, intentions I have. They may want to do something with him as a child to prevent him from growing up. They may want to kidnap him and use him for their own purposes. He's not safe going into Asham because whereas you all aren't lettered, he was not shy about kind of insulting them. You are not people of scholarship. You're just the backwaters of Arabia, as I mentioned. But when you go into places like, Damascus and Jerusalem, no, they're going to know what's going on. These are very scholarly people, some of them. And they're going to see these signs and realize who he is, and he won't be safe. And so you need to turn back and take him back to Mecca. He's not safe going to the Levant right now. And so this was taken very seriously. And what I was really struck by is this is the same uncle who loved him, adored him, heard this firsthand from this scholar of scripture, and yet he still didn't believe. He still didn't believe at the end. And that teaches us something. If you are struggling with a relative, if you are struggling with a child who is struggling with their faith or has even left Islam, don't blame yourself. Don't beat yourself up, because that's the first thing a parent will do. What did I do wrong? Sometimes people just have a different path. I'm not saying we don't pray for we continue to pray for them. We continue to call them back, but we don't internalize this message that I must be a terrible parent because my child is not following the path of Islam right now. Because even Rasulullah والسلام, could not get his own father figure, his own uncle, to take the Shahada before he left the world. Despite all of these signs, he was the one that was told this from the very beginning as a child. He was primed for the idea that this is a messenger. And then Rasulullah والسلام, in fact, got the wahy. So it wasn't like it came out of nowhere. And yet he still could not get one of his most beloved people to him in his own family who raised him to declare, to bear witness to Allah's oneness. And go back to, and so to close off, I wanted to mention the importance of sending salawat. And so if you watched the World Cup or if you watch the Olympics, one of the this has become like a famous, iconic thing is when Muslim athletes win something, they drop into sujood and they do it in front of the whole world. The entire world now knows what a sujood is because of these gestures of piety that Muslim athletes have now become famous for. And sajdat al-shukr, the occasion of it being introduced into our tradition, is so beautiful because Rasulullah ﷺ suddenly fell into sajda as he was walking with the companions ﷺ, and they asked him, "What's going on? What are you doing?" He said, "This is sajda shukr. I'm giving thanks to Allah because I just found out that when you send salawat, one salah on me, Allah sends 10 on you. Because of that, I'm giving thanks." And so that is what you're getting. Salawat on the Nabi is for you. You are benefiting. When I say sallallahu alayhi wasallam, I'm sending one salah on Rasulullah and Allah is sending 10 on me. And that is how you bring peace, you invite peace into your heart and peace into your life by sending salawat ala Rasulullah. So we can end by just doing sending some salawat on Rasulullah. Sallallahu ala Muhammad. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. 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 Sallallahu ala Muhammad. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam.